Hello, and welcome to this Fifth Theory Dimensions webinar, Working from Home, Managing Employee Data Security and Privacy Risk in Pandemic Conditions, presented by Gary Behrens. Fifth Theory is a minority-owned business that provides employment-related assessment tools for screening, selection, training, and development of job applicants and internal candidates. I'm Kelly Dagus, Director of People Analytics and Program Evaluation at Fifth Theory. I will be assisting Gary Behrens today. First, a couple housekeeping tips. All attendees will be in listen-only mode to ensure high-quality audio. We will address questions at the end. Please use the Q&A box located in your toolbar anytime during the webinar. All attendees will receive access to the recording of this webinar, along with a related white paper. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Gary Behrens has an MBA and a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology. He is Assistant Vice President of OD and Leadership Assessment Solutions at Fifth Theory, LLC, with 40 years of experience in personnel measurement, organization development, and program management. He serves as an internal compliance expert and chairs the Privacy Committee that advises Fifth Theory owners about data privacy and compliance issues. Mr. Behrens is active in the Association of Test Publishers, where he co-chairs the International Privacy Subcommittee that has recently published a series of privacy and practice bulletins for ATP members. Previously, he chaired the Security Committee and the Industrial Organizational Division of ATP also. In addition, he chaired another subcommittee that produced the EU General Data Protection Regulation Compliance Guide, a first of its kind industry-specific privacy compliance guide, which assists testing organizations toward meeting data privacy and data protection legal requirements of the European Union. I'm going to turn it over to Gary now. Gary?
Thank you, Kelly. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be presenting this session to you today. And today I will be talking about several aspects of managing data security risks of employees who are working from home during this pandemic situation and which organizations are dealing with now. Let's begin by taking a look at our agenda for the program. Next slide, please, Kelly. First, we will consider whether working from home is simply a new normal state of affairs, as numerous observers have suggested, or if there's something more to it, along with some longer-term implications. Next, I will review data security risks posed by employees that could be associated with the working from home context. Then I will cover recommended strategies for mitigating and managing those risks. From there, we will take a brief look at a job competency model for working from home that complements data security management efforts. And lastly, I will share some assessment tools that organizations can utilize to determine if an employee is up to the challenge of working from home effectively, including information security management responsibilities. Before we get underway, though, let me also just add that the information shared during this webinar should not be construed as legal advice. Viewers are instead encouraged to seek out legal counsel with any specific questions or issues related to information security management in the working from home employee context. Next, and let me also just turn off my video for the duration, and I'll come back at the end for the question and answer session. So, to begin with, the first big question, of course, is working from home a new normal or a big reset? This is a fundamental question. as to the long-term outcomes. Next slide. Well, it seems so far that working from home has proven fairly workable, really reasonably. Last spring, of course, we saw a sudden mass shifting of employees from working in centralized locations to working from home due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequent shelter-in-place work from home orders. For example, a recent survey by Forrester found that nearly half of organizations that responded had transitioned at least half of their workforce to working remotely since the beginning of March. And that was 10 times the percentage of response that they had seen in the same period a year ago. However, Josh Bersin, an HR guru of some renown, has suggested that this is not so much a new normal situation where business will go on as usual, but now we just work from home. Rather, it's a big reset for businesses. It's an opportunity to delayer from the excessive bureaucratic processes and other outgrowths of recent economic expansion of the past decade. He also cites a Bureau of Labor Statistics estimate from recently this year that up to 50 million US jobs could be done from home. So his conclusion is that not all remote working employees will necessarily go back to a central workplace, a physical location, when the economy fully reopens. Supporting that contention, a survey by LinkedIn earlier in the spring, but after the lockdowns occurred, of their remote working professionals who are members of LinkedIn, found that those individuals said, by and large, nearly 2/3 of them felt that they work well from home. In fact, over half of them feel that their whole industry could do likewise. Now, a separate survey at around the same time in the May-June period from McAfee of its consumer base found that of those employees who had shifted to working from home, almost half felt that they did not want to go back into the workplace like it was before. And about 1 out of 5 of those individuals would like to keep working from home for as long as possible. Next. Thus, it seems as though working from home may be here to stay. There's additional support for this that comes from the World Bank's annual economic report on global economic activity that was released just at the time that the pandemic really took hold. It showed that for the past year, in 2019, in the US economy, about 80% of the workforce is employed in the service sector. Josh Bersin contends that that actually supports the working from home model because it emphasizes, particularly in the service sector, jobs like knowledge workers that rely on communication and collaboration skills. Bersin calls these power skills. In fact, a recent survey conducted by Willis Towers Watson of almost 300 large organizations that was reported in July found that nearly 45% of their workforces on average were still working from home. Those organizations by and large anticipate that that is not going to tail off, it's not going to level off until sometime in 2021. And at that point, there will still be approximately 20% of their workforce working from home. At the same time, organizations have been looking at alternate work models for some time. For the past few years, they have been investigating the possibility of relying more on a workforce that was employed working from home. Another Bureau of Labor Statistics estimate or actual data has shown that approximately 25% of employees were already working from home on a regular basis and 15% on an occasional basis. So we could see that approximately 40%, and perhaps a few percent more for those employees like the professionals in the LinkedIn survey, had been exclusively working from home. Following that up, another survey published in July, the report published in July, showed that the overwhelming majority of employees who had started working from home because of the pandemic, 86% would prefer a staggered 4-day in-office work week when the economy opens up and they go back into a physical office location. And that would be in order to limit the number of people around in a particular facility at any given time, and thereby reduce the exposure rates and the risk rates. So businesses are seeing at the same time benefits of having more employees working from home. They've been considering it, and now they're seeing the evidence through greater efficiencies in time, space, and cost savings. They're also seeing higher productivity in the past few months. And along with that, greater satisfaction on the part of the employees due to better work-life balance. In fact, some companies have already announced that employees can continue working from home for an extended period, even indefinitely in some instances, such as at Twitter and Google, which are trendsetters organizations, and other organizations are likely to follow suit. All of this means then that working from home could become a regular feature for many and perhaps most employees in terms of their jobs and their careers going forward. Next slide. Well, that's all very well. In spite of the optimism, though, there is a downside of employees working from home, which doesn't perhaps receive as much media attention, although organizations and their IT departments, their security professionals are well aware of it, and that is the increased data security risks of employees working from home. Next. Let's face it, most organizations were caught flat-footed by the immediate requirement to close up their places of businesses. They had to work very quickly and very hard to reconnect those employees who were retained to be able to remotely connect to their enterprise network system just to keep operating. As a result, there were numerous unmitigated security risks. First of all, many employees were not used to or ready for working from home. As I just pointed out, probably 60% had never worked from home before based on those Bureau of Labor statistics estimates. And other surveys since then, as recently as July, of both employees and employers, has found that anywhere from 40 to 60% of employees haven't received any training yet for working from home, or their organization doesn't have the technology to support working from home, and they're using their own personal devices to do work and connect to the networks, but they're supposed to secure those devices themselves. As you can imagine then, cyber criminals have taken advantage of this lack of preparation and of the resulting confusion. Enterprise threats were up more than 6-fold in a 3-month span, according to McAfee's surveys of its commercial clients. And at the same time, more than half of employees who were working from home reported seeing increased attacks of varying types in the same surveys. Next. Clearly then, employees pose a significant data security risk. Those employees, obviously, who are working from home are vulnerable targets for cyber criminals, but they're also prone to make errors, even in typical circumstances. These are data that were gathered from the past year and reported just a couple of weeks ago in 2 annual global surveys of data security breaches, and they clearly reflect a heightened risk. On the left, you could see Verizon's data breach investigations report with results for 2020, for example. And it shows that a combined 30% of breaches that were reported were due to either employee errors or misuse of employee system user credentials. And in addition to that, of those employees who were making errors that exposed the organization's data to a breach, they also had their own personal information stolen. The other global survey of breaches is the Ponemon Institute's Cost of Data Breach report, and that's sponsored by IBM. Their results, and this included over 520 breaches around the world in the past year, showed that the average cost of an accidental data breach caused by employees was $3.5 million. That compares with the overall cost from all sources for the same period of about 3.9 million. So not much different. A separate analysis, and this is on the most recent data, looking specifically at the cost of breaches associated with misconfiguration of cloud applications. In other words, still a employee error, but rather than sharing information with unauthorized people, forgetting to set the security controls correctly for cloud application, was almost $1 million higher, $4.4 million. Next slide, please. I will say too that in relation to that, as I said, it was from data in the past year, but those surveys, the Ponemon survey, also queried the respondents about their expectations for the impact of more employees working from home on breaches. A majority of them, more than 75%, said that it will take longer to identify a breach, to detect it, and 70% said it will cost more. Well, what can organizations do about this? I'm going to share some general strategies and specific methods to manage the risks of negligent or accidental incidents and breaches that could be caused by employees working from home. Next slide, please. The first strategy, most obviously, is to monitor insider risks of all employees. You have to keep tabs on what employees are doing on the network, including when working from home. We've seen how innocent mistakes and careless actions can cause havoc and cost money. Thus, it's a good idea to set employee access privileges to the network system, the enterprise system, to at the least level necessary for them to do their work as authorized. In addition, monitoring risky online activity is important because that may signal a phishing attack, such as communication with an unknown host or going to a suspicious website. Now, granted, this may be harder if employees are using their own personal devices to connect to the enterprise network. At the least, it's Certainly capable organizations can track what's going on and what they're doing while they're logged in to the enterprise system, but they may not be able to monitor how those employees are behaving in their online activities outside of a work setting. There are potential software solutions that are available. I'm not an expert in them, but I'm aware of solutions such as unified endpoint management software that can help with that. In addition, it's important to watch, of course, for unusual activity within the network and the enterprise system. It could be accidental, it could be intentional. In either case, there should be an automated alert notification system that goes to IT and security whenever a user tries to do something that isn't authorized by their access privileges. That Ponemon survey that I was referring to a moment ago found that almost a $3.6 million savings was achieved in the average cost of a breach by having a fully automated notification system deployed. That compared to $6 million on average for organizations that didn't have any automation in notifying IT or security of potential misuse or errors. Next. Next slide. Okay. Following up to that, a second strategy is to make security protocols mandatory. For example, a highly recommended best practice is to require two-factor authentication for employees to access an organization's network. This is a random code that is sent to an employee after entering their established user login credentials. Those credentials may have been assigned to them, such as username. It might be something, though, that they have made up themselves. And a password is usually determined or set by the user. However, in addition to that, the randomized code that could be sent to them by text message, for example, would enable the organization to authenticate that this is the right person coming into the system. It's also recommended that external links and executables that are received by email should be blocked to prevent system infiltration by downloading malware or from viruses that may be infecting an employee's personal device. Of course, this is easiest when you have somebody working within the network system. Again, if they're outside of the system on their own, casually browsing the internet, you may not be able to prevent mistakes that they may make. So it's important to, first of all, provide organizations with a cybersecurity feedback loop, a way to report any possible phishing scams or pretexting schemes or other threats that they may encounter, but also give them tools, guidance, and resources for safe cybersecurity behavior and practices. It's also a good idea for those employees working remotely to use a virtual private network to access the organization's network. Now, for our viewers today, the Fifth Theory white paper that's available along with this webinar includes a list of best practices for information security do's and don'ts for working from home. And you may find that useful as a starting point for putting together some guidance for employees. Next. A third strategy is to take a look at breach planning and modify or update it as appropriate. Given those risks of employee error, employees working from home with insufficient support, it's not inconceivable that there will be some sort of an incident and hopefully not a breach. But probably most organizations, especially larger ones, have a plan in place. Smaller ones may not. Whatever the case is, this is probably a good time to update and maybe even develop an incident response plan, the IRP. It should include use cases for employees who are working from home, covering both organizational sensitive information as well as personal information. But it's not enough to just have a plan and update it. It's also advisable to assign a standing response team, a cross-functional team that includes IT, security personnel, operations, and legal at the least, and including practice, and more practice with work from home scenarios. Practicing that IRP plan more often than just once a year can improve readiness of the team, and it can also help hold down the cost of a breach if one should occur by $2 million on average, according to the Ponemon survey. Next. Organizations shouldn't wait to do employee security and training orientation just because of the COVID-19 pandemic. You have to make data security orientation a priority. I've already mentioned the fact that a large percentage of employees working from home haven't been trained yet. There might be a sense of not wanting to overwhelm those employees and place extra demands in the midst of the pandemic. However, making data security protection a part of the organization's culture is vital. It's crucial then to promote data protection policies of the organization, share those best practices and checklists for securing sensitive business information, such as trade secrets, and also personal information. You can encourage working from home employees to report issues and incidents using those feedback channels that were pointed out in an earlier slide. That could include suspicious emails, possible threats, but also owning up to their own mistakes. It's important to identify those without blame in order to get ahead of the curve and begin to address them as quickly as possible. And then conduct that training on a regular basis, not just every once in a while or once a year. Next. This last strategy, mapping work from home data incidents as fully as possible, might be the toughest one because it means following up on every incident as well as every breach to determine what happened, to take remedial action steps quickly in order to prevent recurrence, and then to determine if it's reportable or not. I'm going to come back to that last point in just a moment. Getting in front of these data incidents, some of which could turn out to be breaches, is very important, and it starts with defining the parameters of the evaluation process itself. As recommended by the International Association of Privacy Practitioners, it should be a multi-factor approach. And it should be tailored, in my opinion, to the working from home context as well. The reason why is that it may become necessary to rely more on those employees and their forthcomingness by interviewing them and providing checklists, because if they're using their personal devices, that might not be obtainable for forensic analysis. Now, whether or not an incident is determined to be notifiable, it's a good idea to document the logic for reaching a decision one way or the other, so that there is a basis for defensibility in case of an audit or in case of legal action. Just for everyone's information, you may not be aware, but every US state and territory has its own breach reporting law, and they have different criteria for determining if it's a reportable breach or not. And thus, it's necessary to be able to justify a decision not to report an incident or a breach. That may also come in handy for informing data privacy officials at the state or local jurisdiction level, or communicating to an affected customer base in the case of a reportable breach. Next. A number of HR consulting organizations jumped into action right at the outset of the pandemic and started developing competency models for working from home that include data security competencies. We've distilled the essential elements of those models into a single set of core competencies that can generalize across organizations and business sectors for employees who are in contributor roles and working from home. Next. Of course, a major challenge for employees who are working from home now is self-management. There's less structure, less supervision, and less support. It's almost like they're out on their own, home alone, but not really, because there are multiple possible distractions even in that home environment, including other people who may in themselves present data security risks. Thus, the core self-management competencies include being autonomous, which is the ability to be self-directed, self-reliant, and resourceful, and also productive in prioritizing tasks and focusing effort on getting important work done. Along with that, managing time well and getting that work done in a timely way are certainly important too. But perhaps most critical in this context is information and online security in terms of taking care of information and watching out for security threats. Now, that may seem a bit outside the usual range of job description behaviors to some employees. However, when working from home, it's especially critical that an employee recognize and own up to this responsibility, as we've seen earlier. And then, in addition, communication competencies are also vital in the working from home context because of the remote virtual interactions that take place. And just as this webinar is occurring today, online virtual meetings have mushroomed in the past several months, and they are a prime target for many of those cyber criminals who are trying to disrupt and take advantage and access personal information and organization sensitive information. But those employees who are in those situations are oftentimes anxious and eager to interact, and they may let down their guard. It's important for them to remember to not divulge sensitive information inadvertently when they say something casually that could reveal confidential business information. Next. Well, then organizations are in a bit of a dilemma. They need to have people working from home. Those people potentially raise information security risks. And besides the lack of preparation and resources, not all employees are equally or readily capable of handling the additional responsibilities and competencies that go with working from home effectively. Organizations can bridge the gap by using validated employment assessment tools to gauge employee and workforce training and development needs, including taking care to be alert to information security risks. Next. Fifth Theory brings decades of experience in creating employment assessments to this situation and providing solutions. Fifth Theory offers a wide variety of well-researched, fair, and validated self-report measures that organizations can use to address this situation. Some of those selected Fifth Theory measures of work-related skills and attitudes are shown here to help assess employee competencies and mindset for working well from home. Now, mindset is a constellation of attitudes, motivations, and skills that predispose behavior tendencies in a given set of circumstances. And so these measures of self-management across the three areas that we identified and looked at a moment ago in the competency model can address those mindset skills and attitudes and motivations. Importantly, among those, you can see that information and online security competency can be addressed and assessed either directly through a measure of information security management or indirectly with measures of attitudes toward attention to detail, conscientiousness, or responsibility. All of those measures could potentially be used in combination as well. And you can see that there are certainly other well-defined measures of competency and mindset in autonomy, productivity, task completion, and time management. Next. To wrap up, there are three key takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. First, employees and employers are both adapting to a big reset in where and how work is done. Now, many of those employees say that they feel comfortable, more comfortable perhaps than at the beginning, and work well at home, and that they're just as productive. At the same time, employers are starting to see that there are benefits from having a workforce at home. And it's important too, because that is likely to become an ongoing reality. Secondly, data security risks are still out there. They're not going away, and they need continuing attention. Cyber criminals are actively targeting employees working from home and the enterprise systems that support that. So organizations have to take IT support and security efforts to a new level to protect the data security of business-sensitive information, as well as employee personal information, not only from external threats, but also from insider risks. And finally, working from home productively calls for an altered set of work competencies from doing a job at a physical workplace. Fifth Theory helps organizations to be able to assess employee mindset to adapt. There are valid assessment tools to measure the competencies that are related to working from home securely and effectively. For more information about these and other Fifth Theory assessment tools, please visit our website at FifthTheory.com and contact us via our email address, info@FifthTheory.com. That concludes the formal presentation. We should have some time for addressing any questions from the viewers.
Hi, Gary. We have a couple questions we can address. First,
Great.
how long should organizations plan to support the bulk of their workforces in a work from home setting?
Thank you, Kelly. That's a very good question because it goes to the heart of the matter, and it involves forecasting everything from the pandemic to the business recovery cycle. I'll try to keep it simple, though. I think you have to plan on probably 2 and maybe 3 years for this to settle out. And as one of those surveys I mentioned points out, organizations are anticipating about 20% of their workforce being at home. Now think about it. On the medical side, by some estimates, we've only achieved about a 1% herd immunity so far in the US. And even people who have survived from COVID-19 may have a long road to recovery ahead of them with limited support services. It seems possible that there could be several vaccines available in the next 6 months to a year, but we don't know yet if those will be equally effective, what side effects there might be, how long immunity might last, etc. and you still have to convince people to go and get a vaccine when it's available. And of course, there's the human element side, the psychology of going back into a workplace. Is it safe? And I've grown accustomed to working from home now. On top of those are the big reset projections I talked about. If most people can work productively at home, and there are cost efficiencies, as well as better morale, how necessary is it to bring people back into the workplace?
Thank you. Another question, do you recommend organizations provide training on how to work from home? And if so, how often should that training be completed?
Yes, that's a very good question too. We saw that there are surveys where anywhere from 40 to 60% of employees haven't been trained. They're not sure what to do. You know, what this reminds me of is that in past years, HR managed the working from home situation. Employees had to make a request to their managers. They had to demonstrate why they could work from home, how they could continue to be productive. That manager had to then recommend them and escalate it to HR. HR took care of everything after that, including policy, training, setting them up for connectivity through IT with secure credentials. That went away with the pandemic. It may be starting to come back, but those organizations have a lot, and the HR groups in particular, have a lot of things on their plate right now. It would be best, though, if there could be workforce orientation training, just as there is for new employee orientation when an individual comes into the organization, to understand what their responsibilities are and what the challenges and the expectations are. And that should be done not just at the outset, but on an ongoing basis. And it could fold in with the security, information security management elements that we've talked about.
All right. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Are your assessments online, and how long does it take to complete your assessments?
Yes. In fact, these instruments that I described briefly have been delivered online for 20 years. They are generally untimed. Many of them can be completed by an individual in anywhere from 10 or 15 minutes to 20 or 30 minutes. It depends on the specific measure and how that is put together. If you use them in combination, of course, it will take a little bit longer than doing just one or two. And they don't require any monitoring or oversight, which is referred to as online monitoring, because there's no right or wrong answers typically. It's just self-report measures of those attitudes, behavior preferences, and competencies. They're completed on Fifth Theory's secure website. We utilize industry standard technical, physical, and organizational measures to protect the data.
Okay, that's all we have time for.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending this webinar today. We appreciate your participation. I hope that you've learned useful information that you can take back to your organizations for supporting your remote employee workforce. I appreciate it. Have a good day and take care.